Hello. In our last several lectures, we have examined various functions of management, how the management thought itself has evolved, different functional areas of management, and we have also dwelt upon the concept of organization and the drivers of organizational change, organization development, and then we have also examined some of the aspects of the group and group behavior. Today we will focus on the specific aspects of conflict management. This and the next couple of lectures we will focus on how conflicts come about in the organization, why conflicts are important to be managed, and how to increase the functional aspects of the conflict, and then we will also see how extremely important to manage these conflicts for overall success of the group, success of the organization, for the good of the individual well-being and also the performance. So in this session, what I intend to cover is the following. At the end of this session, you must have learnt and understood what is the concept of this conflict and conflict management, and what are the traditional views of conflict, and also we will look at the different conflict management techniques and explore the different views about the conflict and conflict management methodologies. Look at the dimension of it is a process that begins when one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about. I think this is the view of the conflict. Means always to imagine any conflict means there are two parties. So without two sides of the coin there is no conflict. So that means that there is always a kind of that there is one affecting the other. So the negatively affecting and is about to look at these two sides of the coin and see what is to be done. So the conflict and conflict management, when we see, basically we need to see four dimensions and four aspects. First of all, how conflicts come about. The second, we need to see what happens during the conflict situation. And the third, we need to see what are the consequences of the conflict, and then finally how to resolve the conflict. So the conflict management understanding demands an analysis of all these things: the causes, the etiology of the conflict, how conflicts come about, and then the other is the dynamics, what happens during the conflict situation, the interplay, the interactions, and the consequences which are functional or dysfunctional, and as well as how to work towards resolution. So the resolving of the conflicts and management of the conflict situation to get some better outcomes and avoid some of the negative consequences. So when we are seeing this, according to many, the ingredients of conflict, if you see, fundamentally it starts with the needs. So when you are talking about the needs are things that are essential to our well-being, and one would like to see this. It could be with respect to the physiological needs, or it could be the kind of psychological needs, and there could be some of the esteem needs. There are some social needs. People also talk about the self-actualization needs. So according to the Maslow, the need hierarchy, one can perceive the needs at different levels, and the needs could mean many things in its context. So the needs are the things are definitely essential, but when you see the conflict arises, the conflicts come when we ignore the needs of the others, or we neglect our own needs or the group needs. So that is usually when needs are neglected, needs are not taken care of, needs are not met, it results in a kind of a conflict situation. So the other view of the conflict, how comes about, is because of the perceptions. That is, the people interpret reality differently. People see parts of the story. People don't get that kind of a complete picture. All of you have heard that story of the 5 blind men. So each one of them wanted to go and touch the elephant, and then they perceived, and then they came back and described that somebody thought it is who touched the tail, he thought it is a kind of a rope. One who touched the leg, he said it is something like a pole. So there are people who touch different parts, came back and described differently. So similarly, when people perceive, they see what is that they want. Sometimes they are not sensitive to all the cues perceived by what is available, and the perceptions are also influenced by the need. As you know, when we are hungry, every hotel board becomes very apparent. When we are looking for buying of medication or buying some medicines, the hotel boards are not so very clear to us, but all the medical shop boards become very relevant. So that is how the perceptions, if you see, it is influenced very much by the needs as well. So the perceived differences, and you see in the severity, causes and the consequences of the problems. So the perceptions do vary from one individual to the other. It depends upon what they are seeing, why they are seeing, based on their needs, and also what do they see it as a kind of a consequences. So the kind of a partial perception of the situation can also get into that kind of a disagreements and the differences in the views and the opinions. So the misperceptions or differing perceptions may come from the self-perceptions, also what people talk about the others' perception. You may be seeing it right, but others are not seeing what you are seeing, and differing perceptions of the situations. Some may be seeing it as very favorable, some may be seeing it as highly discomforting. So it depends upon the differing perceptions of the situations, and also the perceptions of threat. How do they see it as the future? How do they see the consequences as? So when we are seeing these perceptions, we do get all into all of these in its complexities. So your own clarification becomes extremely important because of the misperceptions, and also sometimes the differing perceptions where you think you are correct, the others are also correct, or when you think you are correct but others are not so correct. So the concerns of this nature. Apart from the needs and the perceptions, we also have to talk about the perception about the power. How people define and use power in an important influence on the members and the types of conflicts that occur. So in other words, how people use their positional power, also an influence to acquire resources, also influences the others in the context. So the dynamics of power and the pursuit of power generates the conflict in the other, and sometimes why should I accept, why should I obey, and that builds that kind of a resistance, and also the different perceptions of the situation can add to this power and power play. And conflict can arise when people try to make others change their actions to gain an unfair advantage, and particularly when you are using the power over the other and it is not seen as a legitimate, or it is seen as harassment, or it is seen as exploitation, it is seen as undue processes. I think that is the time where the power and the power play also brings or creates that kind of a conflict situation. And when power deprives the gain of the other, when the influence of power affects meeting one's own interests, and that is another situation, again one can see how conflicts come about. We have talked about the power, we have talked about the needs, we have talked about the perceptions. The other dimension is the values. Values, as we have seen, are another kind of beliefs or principles one considers as very important. And the basis of the values is usually the role models, it is what one would stand for, and also the kind of socialization process and the influence process one has gone through in the past. So the strong do's and don'ts get developed over a period of time, and the values are internalized beliefs and attitudes. So there is a serious conflict arises when people hold very incompatible values, or also what values at sometimes when the values are not very clear. And particularly we have seen the food habits, for example, and food habits are developed over a period of time depending on the social and the kind of a contextual factors. However, people do hold very strong values about the vegetarianism, and when they have that kind of a values, they may also get into an action of rejecting of those people who are not belonging to that particular group, or those of them who are non-vegetarians. So such kind of a thing where the values also can become incompatible. So that means people don't hold similar values, same values you may not like to associate with, or you would like to destroy them, or you would like to eliminate them, you would like to remove them from the social context or the social situations. So then incompatible values would affect not only the relationship but also builds that kind of a tension, builds that kind of a conflict. And that is how the value conflicts are difficult to resolve and difficult to find an appropriate solutions, and one need to see the needs, the power, the perceptions, and also the values. Conflict also arises when one party refuses to accept the fact that the other party holds something as a value rather than a preference. So the preference is different, convenience is different, the principles are different. So the principles and values are much more stronger reasons, and such reasons when results in conflict, it also builds the kind of pressure, it also consumes a lot of energy to resolve it. Then one can also see in terms of the feelings and emotions. So the many people let their feelings and emotions, and they become major influence over how they deal with the conflict. So that time when some people get charged, some people can get very depressed, some people would like to react overtly, some are reacting covertly. These things do influence how the conflicts are generated. Conflicts can also occur because people ignore their own or others' feelings and emotions. When such suppressions take place, when people keep their intense thoughts to themselves, it results in the problems within, what people refer to as intrapersonal conflicts. And intrapersonal conflicts and sometimes the interpersonal conflicts, when views and feelings are suppressed, it finds its own level. Suddenly the outburst, or suddenly you see the over kind of a conflict comes because of the repressed feelings and emotions over a period of time. One can also see the other conflicts, how they come about in terms of these feelings and emotions, and particularly when they differ over a particular issue. Conflict must be avoided, and many people see it as it's an indication of a kind of a malfunction within the group. So that means people are not provided the opportunity to express. In the group situation, they are not discussing the things in an open, free and a frank manner. The communications are not managed well, conflicts also come when people see the kind of a consequences favoring only one group of people or one individual at the cost of the others. And so the conflicts are seen as it must be avoided. And the traditional view of conflict is also that all conflicts are bad, either you must eliminate the conflict or you must suppress all the conflicts, because it is basically bad in nature. However, the modern views of conflict is changing, because the conflict view is that it does provide what is happening in the situation, particularly in terms of that poor management practices or poor systems or poor philosophies. So the conflict always is seen as a kind of a result of the consequences of these undermanaged or understated policies and practices, and so it is desirable to tighten or improve and correct those things. So conflict can also be viewed as violence, so that means it is seen as destruction. So the destruction of the traditional things, so then it is seen as irrational to reinforce this negative connotation. So the question is, the conflict in its aftermath, if somebody is seeing, then it is always seen as not desirable. It affects the stability of the system. It destroys the individual creativity or the individual existence. So many people view very seriously the conflict as most undesirable, and it must be avoided, and particularly when it is resulting in violent kind of reactions. The human relations view of conflict is a little different, but it is an improved one, where conflict is seen as a kind of a natural occurrence in all groups and organizations. It comes from the belief that individuals do differ. Individuals do differ in terms of their attitudes, in terms of their upbringing, in terms of their own attitudes and experiences. So that is where the conflicts are bound to happen in any work groups, conflicts are bound to happen in any organization. So that is how it is seen as a natural occurrence. So that means as conflict is seen as inevitable, now it has to be managed, it has to be accepted. So the conflict is seen as inevitable because needs do differ, the people do perceive things in different ways, and people come with different degrees of need for power and the way they exercise power over the other, and also people do bring different values to the table. Unless you create an appropriate induction process, appropriate socialization process, and also a reorganization of the priorities, the conflict cannot be managed, conflict cannot be handled. So that is where one need to see how conflict will benefit a group's performance or how conflict affects the group performance. So the different perceptions, differing views in any group can finally result in the division of the group itself. So that is where no doubt you are perceiving this conflicts as inevitable as individuals differ, but the consequences should not result in group breaking or affecting the group cohesion or belongingness to the group. In fact, you should be able to integrate the members. You should be able to build that kind of a cohesion and trust amongst the group members. I think that is where the managing conflict to the good of the group, to the benefit of the group, and also improving and influencing the performance becomes much more relevant and seen as a kind of a process in human relations school. There is also an interactionist view of the conflict. So this approach encourages conflict on the grounds that it is harmonious, peaceful, tranquil and cooperative. These are all the kind of things which is desirable. So as long as this conflict results in some of these things, then it is fine. and as long as it is seen as against, that has to be avoided. So then the question is what kind of a conflict you would like to promote and what kind of a conflict you would like to repress becomes an important view of this interactionist. Then you also should see that this group is prone to becoming very static, apathetic and non-responsive towards the need for change and innovation. So that means you want to avoid conflicts. So you want to have extremely a peaceful coexistence, and then that people are there to build relationships, and so you tend to neglect the inherent, the difficulties, the conflicts and the challenges also are there part of the life. So people describe this as also the peace of the graveyard. So the other interactionist view is that it encourages the group leaders to maintain an ongoing minimum level of conflict. So in other words, you want to see enough to keep the group viable. So if there are anything, if you see the kind of more differences, more arguments, then you would like to buy those arguments in terms of settle it through a suppression, through teaching people that it is not desirable to express and attack and be simple, be accommodative, and build that kind of a philosophy where people don't confront, but rather than they become part of the conflict through accepting such situations. So interactionist view some have rejected. The other view in terms of the functional conflict, so that means a conflict that supports the goals of the group and improves its performance. So that is where how conflicts can be integrated to meet or increase the performance levels. So the functional conflict and dysfunctional conflicts have been brought. So the functional conflict refers to a kind of a confrontation between the two parties. So that means you stick to your position and then you start working from your position, then argue and then disagree, but then you also see the opportunities of what to combine, and so that is how you get into the newer solutions which improves or benefits the overall organizational or the team performance. So the conflict, even though initially starts with the disagreeing perspectives, but gets integrated and contributes to the overall performance, and that is how the functional conflict many would like to have it, and also would like to promote. So at the individual's level, functional conflict can create a number of desirable consequences. So that one would like to see, yes, should I work hard, should I look at the career, so the career which provides the opportunities, but also it makes you to take up challenges and deliver the results. So when you see at some point of time they appear to be extremely conflicting, because you have to compromise something at this stage in order to be more successful to the future. So that means when somebody is walking a distance and then also thinking of the destination, sometimes reaching the destination will help the individual to forget the problems involved in the travel and also the kind of conditions in which one has to travel, because the destination is more attractive. So in other words, an individual requires a certain level of stimulation, certain level of excitement to feel enthusiastic about their work. So the end result need to be attractive, end result is a very desirable one, and such psychological attachment to the end result always helps people the simulation will help to overcome some of the difficulties, some of the odd conditions in pursuit of those goals. So that is how it is seen as functional, because no doubt it is conflicting, but there are ends which are highly desirable. So the view of the functional conflict is to produce the desired results, and to produce the desired results, however, the conflict must somehow be limited or contained to appropriate levels of intensity. So that means people have to work within the rules of the game, within the accepted norms of the group, and then one can see that it results in some useful things. But if it results in disintegration, then it is not desirable. And that is how we also get this view of the dysfunctional conflict. So that means the conflict that hinders the group performance, which breaks the social system, which breaks the organization, which also contributes problems of communication and relationship, which also causes the breakdown of the individuals, are all seen as the dysfunctional conflict. So which affects the individual, group or the organization into the inaction, or where people have to leave or people have to quit that kind of a situation, is always referred to as the dysfunctional consequences and to be called as dysfunctional conflict. So the dysfunctional conflict refers to any interaction between the two parties that hinders or destroys the achievement of the organizational or group goals. So whenever it comes in the way of this overall performance, so the differing views, differing perceptions or exploitation of needs, pursuit of interest, all these things at the cost of one individual, or elimination of any one individual, or elimination or destruction of part of the group, is to be seen as dysfunctional conflict. And it is extremely important to see what are the stages of the conflict. Stages of the conflict assumes that there is always a history to any conflict. So one can see that these are stages of conflict in terms of potential opposition or a kind of a perceived incompatibility. So then you also see the next is a kind of a cognition, that is perception, and also a kind of a personalization. Then you can also see the intentions of what one would do, and then resulting in terms of the specific behaviors. Unless one is very sensitive to these different stages, and the solutions also could vary from one level to the other, and that is how the sensitivities are important. When we see the potential opposition, the presence of conditions that create opportunity for conflict is necessary. So that means there are three general categories. So that means one need to see very clearly that the communication. So in the communication, the differing word connotation, the jargons, or insufficient exchange of information and noise, and basically you see there are several barriers to this communication, and potential antecedent conditions for conflict. So that means people use the words, people use the wrong words, people use words which are offensive, people use or people don't give out complete picture, or they hide that required information. So many of these things are present, and the communication provides one important ground. How do the conflicts come about? So there is not any of these into the pure forms, but in combination it can add to the kind of a confusion. So the other part of the communication is that confusion or that ambiguity of the situation. The next point is that kind of a structure. So here then you are seeing the size and the degree of specialization in the task assigned to the group members. So that means the people, the kind of work, sometimes you see the quality checks is seen as a kind of an affecting one's performance, or sometimes auditing processes. So they have to pursue their goals, but the other group may not see the reason why somebody should be asking for all the details, or why one should check every step and things like that. So there are people who would perceive, because of these different degrees of specialization and how they perform their tasks, and also the kind of clarity. The members should know very clearly why certain tasks are performed in certain fashion, and also the member compatibility, and the leadership is all part of this kind of a structure. So when you see the structure also creates the kind of the conflict, and there is a potential opposition. So if any disturbance is there, it leads to conflict. That means if these things are not aligned, if the things are not perceived, if the things are not explained, so many of these things result in a conflict situation, then maybe it could also be increased if the group is large and also more specialized are the activities. And that is how we see conflicts come between different functions. Conflicts come in some of the R&D groups because they are very specialized groups. So the methodology or the solutions proposed by one group may not be acceptable to the other groups. We also see some of the personal variables coming into the picture, and we have seen earlier these includes value systems that each person has, and also the personality characteristics that account for the individual styles and functioning. And some of the personal differences also can create that kind of a disliking. The styles, the communication, and also the way one would like to give opportunities, one would like to support others, and many of these things are absent, and very opinionated people, very strong attitudes, very strong do's and don'ts, and rejection of other people based on these do's and don'ts can create noise, and such noise when people perceive in different ways, and when people perceive that, it affects their own specific requirements, and then it can always result in. And certainly the cognition and the next this personalization. So the perceived conflict is the awareness by one or more parties of the existence of conditions that create opportunities for conflict to arise. As we are seeing this cognition and personalization, that we are talking about the felt conflict. Felt conflict is the emotional involvement. When people get into the conflict situation, and there is always, they come with that anxiety about what's going to happen to the future, what's going to happen to my career, what is going to happen to my family members. So this anxiety and tension, and also the frustration that other person is getting more than me, and also the coming out of that kind of the hostility, where the enmity or the previous history and things like that, where the perception gets distorted, the perception has a history, and then it gets internalized to the individuals. So the conflicts you need to see due to cognition and as well as this personalization. Another important thing is to see the intentions. Basically the parties, how do they see it as from the basis for decisions to act in a given way in a conflict episode. And when we see these intentions, it is to identify the primary conflict handling intentions. Now one can use this following parameters. We will talk about this much more in a later point of time. One is this intention of competing. So it is the desire to satisfy one's interest regardless of the impact on the other party in the form of some conflict. So it is a kind of a win-lose kind of an approach to the problem. So I don't mind that, I don't care what happens to the other. So but my cake, my size, my taste, my requirements, my comfort, I think people get into that. So similarly the other can get into. So very competitive kind of an approach to the problem. So that's the time where people assert from their position, assert from their resources whatever they bring to the table. They also talk about the kinds of things what they have been handled in the past. So usually you will see the reaction is aggressive, the reaction is intolerance, the reaction is dominance, the reaction is that if other wants to fight, let them. I think that's the approach when people come with this kind of a competing kind of an intention. You will also see intention is people want to get into collaboration. So where parties to the conflict, so no doubt they have that issue, but they want to satisfy their desire, not only themselves, but also they have a concern for the other. Okay, they would like to see what is that the other person can do. I think this is where they, when they start perceiving the role of themselves and the role of the other, so they get into that kind of a collaborative mode. So the collaborative situations, you will see the parties to the conflict, the perceptions of each other is to desire, satisfy fully all the concerns of all the parties. So that means you think I am important, all my concerns are important, all my requirements are important, my values are important, but at the same time I do not want to achieve something where the other fellow gets cheated out or other fellow feels bad about it. So I want to work through and see how do I get this. So collaborative mode has the concern for both. And the third one is one of avoiding. So it is the desire to withdraw from or suppress a conflict. So people they look, I don't want to argue, I don't want to fight, I don't want to use any of my energy. So when they come to the kind of a conflict situation, no doubt they have a clear perceived conflict, but their one of intention is that a kind of a peaceful coexistence, or it is that they are very intolerant of the conflict itself. So they want to behave as though that there is no problem, or they want to say okay, forget about it. So what does it take? Okay, he is going to blame me, let him blame me, but I don't want to argue with the other person. So people try to take this attitude of one of giving up, one of forgetting, one of saying okay. So they added chalta hai. So many of these things are part of this avoiding kind of an attitude and what they bring to the as a kind of an intention. Another is in terms of accommodating. So it is that willingness of the party, okay, in a conflict prone situation, okay. So this so can we see the opponent or the other person also what is that they would like to talk about. So that means you talk about their demands and the concerns of the other, but also you also have a concern for yours, and that is where you look for compromise. So that is a kind of a give and take, and then what could be done in that kind of a situation. So that is where the intentions of the parties are very important in any conflict understanding and conflict management. So all the four styles, but finally come to the kind of a compromising. But in an accommodating style, people give up their rights, but in a compromising thing, they do hold on to some of their rights. So that is where the compromising is a kind of a conciliation kind of a situation, in which each party to a conflict is willing to give up something. So I think that is where the compromising is possible. So what is that intention, what they bring to the table could define these positions. So the conflicts become visible in behavior. So that is where we are talking about the kind of things where there are always some hidden part to the conflict, and then there are a set of things become very explicit. So this stage includes statements, action and reaction exhibited by the conflicting parties. So people shout, people make through the verbal gestures. So people also can use the group pressures and many of these things. So these are a kind of an open visible aspect of the conflict behaviors. So when you see the conflict management techniques, one can list many, but these are not of eliminating any conflict, it is not suppressing any conflict, but it is only to work through and regulate the consequences of any negative things of any conflict situation. So, the problem solving is one of the methods. What is problem solving is to have a kind of a face to face meeting of the conflicting parties for the purpose of identifying the problems and also resolving them through the open discussion. So, in a problem solving thing is that they have to ask questions and they have to sit together for a period of time and then elaborating on what is the difficulty, what is the problem, whose problem it is, and then also generating enough solutions to what is that could be done about it, and then agreeing upon certain things. So, through the following things we can solve the problem. So, that means an open discussion, open mindset, and then spending that kind of a required time, having some tolerance to that not everything could be the best thing, but always you are searching for some of the best possible solution. The other aspect what has been suggested is to have the superordinate goals. Superordinate goals is creating a kind of a shared goal of the future. So, unless that you understand that future goal and also perceive that it cannot be attained without the cooperation of all the concerned. So, that means each of the conflicting parties see that as a kind of an agenda for collaboration. Let us take some of our own experiences. When there is a threat at the national level, several groups come together. Now, the immediate thing is that to focus on that kind of an external enemy. So, that becomes a superordinate goal, and then so that internal immediate differences does not become, or they do not become any great concern. So, the superordinate goals means you are talking about where both the parties perceive, yes, we need to work together to increase the size of the cake. So, many of the people suggest that integrative bargaining versus the distributive bargaining. So, distributive bargaining is to cut the size of the cake as is, but the integrative bargaining demands a kind of a superordinate goals where both the parties first attempt to increase the size of the cake and then they work out a methodology of cutting the cake itself. So, the superordinate goals provide an opportunity for collaboration, and as we said that it is the expansion of resources. So, usually the resources are the basic problem, and the scarcity of resources. Scarcity of resources, it could be money, promotional opportunities, then it could be the office space, and many of these things could become a problem of concern. So, that means you have to see how do we generate more resources. So, the focus should be not on the use of the resources or sharing of the resources, but to focus more on how to go about it. And also the promotional opportunities. In many organizations earlier, the vacancy based promotion used to be there. The vacancy based promotions had a problem that unless the senior person moves out, senior person himself or herself gets promoted to the next level, then there was no chance for the juniors. So, but then assured career promotion paths came. So, that means every 4th year, every 5th year, whether the vacancy is there or not, you move to the next grade. So, that is the time where many of the interpersonal problems, many of the organizational problems came down drastically because that you do have your opportunities. So, you can create that kind of a win-win situation where you expand the resources, you provide alternate paths of moving up in the organizational hierarchy. So, the conflict management technique would be that expansion of the resources. Avoidance is the other kind of a thing what people have talked about, but withdrawal from or suppression of the conflict, withdrawal from or suppression of the conflict is basically avoidance, but avoidance is a kind of a lose-lose proposition. So, avoidance is when you are not involved in the organization, avoidance is where you are not involved in the production or with the people, one can get into that. So, it is a kind of a retirement kind of a syndrome, but however it is not very effective. Avoidance is not an effective conflict management technique, but at times as it could only provide some kind of a temporary things. Smoothing is another thing, where playing down differences while emphasizing common interest between the conflicting parties. So, at times you find that the conciliation or the of where somebody is trying to look at, so people do talk about that first of all that there is not much of a differences between the parties, and then you also emphasize that all of us are here in the interest of either the interest of the organization, interest of the task, interest of taking care of set of people. So, you bring those common meeting ground, meeting points, but underplay that no, we agree on 85%, 90%, 95%, 97, 99% of the things. That means you keep on emphasizing that where you agree upon, and then say that very small percentage where we disagree, and then you emphasize those common points, but then the conflict becomes much more easy, because now people perceive that there are larger things you agree upon and there are small areas where you can give up. So, smoothing takes that kind of an approach, and altering this kind of a human variables. That means using behavioral change techniques such as human relations training. So, particularly the to make that people to think the like this rational emotive therapy, called this RET kind of a technique. It alter attitudes and behavior that causes conflict. So, somebody may walk into the house, mother may be reading the paper. So, that means you may think that mother is not interested in taking care of my welfare, or she is not interested in me. It is a one kind of a conflict somebody can perceive it as, but then the individual is asked to think a little more rationally. So, that means you are making set of assumptions, now question your assumptions. So, why not? So, when you are coming home, but why not she should read the paper? So, that if reading the paper means, what is the obvious guarantee that she is not interested in you? So, there are many of these kinds of a self-talk, self-question may make you come to that kind of a generalization. Yes, people can read the paper, but when you go there, that obviously she must stop the reading the paper and react to you or take care of and serve food to you. So, these kinds of making that kind of an emotional assumptions about the others will help you to reduce that conflict with other people. Sometimes authoritative command is a useful thing. So, that means a formal authority intervenes, and then in a conflicting communities where they are not managing their interdependencies, so that they could be told about what are their priorities, how is that they should do, you structure it or you create a new process. It is also possible to create a compromise, so that each party to the conflict gives up something of value. So, that means in a compromise position, the third party induces, third party forces, third party helps. So, helping, inducing, forcing, these are all part of this compromising, where they give the people give up some of their things to the other. Then you also talk about the structural variables, altering the structure variables in particularly in the organizational context, changing the formal organization structure and the interaction patterns of conflicting parties. So, what you can do is through redesign, sometimes where people do not have to come into the physical contact, but they do complete it, and then there are charts which shows or the color codes which shows that the completed items are half worked items. Sometimes you may have to transfer some people or some group of people physically away from the same situations, or create some kind of a new parties or new groupings, and so that there is a kind of a job rotation where people work with different groups of people. Another thing is that in any conflict situation, people stop communication or they do not communicate. So using ambiguous or threatening messages, they increases the conflict levels. So honest communication, honest dialogue reduces the threat perception, reduces that anxiety, and communication is another important thing. And then the conflict stimulation techniques, you can see sometimes bringing in outsiders. So that means conflicts are desirable, sometimes conflicts are useful, and then you are adding some employees to the group whose backgrounds, values, attitudes or managerial styles differ from those of the present members. So they bring in different perspectives, they question, and such conflicts bring more creativity. Such conflicts also will help to see some new things. I think that is where the conflict stimulation techniques are useful. The other one is the restricting the organization, realizing the work groups, that altering rules and regulations, increasing interdependencies, and making similar structural changes to disrupt the status. So that means you break some of the things and create new opportunities, so people bring new problems. So the conflict stimulation through restructuring and restricting certain things also will help. Sometimes somebody will question, so it's not that appointing a devil's advocate. So designate a critic to purposely argue against the majority held by the group. They question the assumptions, the way they have done the things in the past. So these are some of the things where it generates some of the conflicts, and discussion and working through would be most useful. So in this lecture, what we have seen so far is the concepts on conflict management, traditional view of conflict, and different conflict management techniques, and also how to stimulate some of the conflicts for the good of the organization. So in the next session, we will have a close look at the following: the classes of conflicts, approaches to the resolution of conflicts, and then positive aspects of conflict, and the causes of this intergroup conflict, and the various dimensions of this.